for SPY for having me, and thank you to my fellow presenters. And that was actually an excellent lead into my presentation, because I will actually be talking about the benefits and limits of pro-social incentive schemes. And what I mean by that, what a pro-social incentive scheme is when you link charitable contributions to effort. And when are these sorts of incentive schemes better for motivating performance and effort than standard incentive schemes, and when are they worse? So this is really motivated by this work of Mike Norton and colleagues. This was a science paper in 2008, and they found that people reported being happier when they spent money on others than when they spent money on themselves. So the experiment went like this. Individuals were given $10, and they were told, spend this money on yourself by the end of the day. They got a phone call, and then they were asked to report how happy they felt. Or they were told, like, spend this $10 on others, and how happy do you feel? And what the authors found is that actually people reported feeling happier when the money was spent on others than on themselves. And the interesting part about that is that they didn't have an intuition for this. So when they were asked, what do you think will make you happier, spending money on yourself or spending money on others, people said that they would be happier spending money on themselves. So there's this sort of forecasting error there. So the implication of this paper, at the end of the paper, they say that policy should work to kind of push people to be more charitable, because they actually mispredict how happy they will be, how well off they would be. So the paper started with me thinking that designing these sorts of pro-social incentive schemes where people work for charity might actually be more effective than standard incentive schemes under some conditions. And that's what I'm going to explore today. So take a weight loss program set up by a firm. So let's say a firm wants their workforce to lose some weight, and this is great for the workforce, this is great for the firm, more productivity, happier workforce, and the firm has $5 to give per pound lost. So they tell their workforce, listen, for every pound that you lose, report it to us, scale in, and we'll give you $5 for every pound. So a pound is actually not trivial to lose. And when you're on that treadmill and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to get $5 for this pound that I'm going to lose, that might not be that motivating. $5 is not that much money. You can buy, That's how I run on a treadmill. Maybe. I don't run on too many treadmills. So especially if you run like me, you're not going to lose too much weight. So we argue that $5 is not going to be too motivating, and the evidence on these sorts of incentivized programs for weight loss has been very mixed. Most find that these sorts of small incentives don't actually get people to lose weight. But what if instead of getting $5 for yourself, $5 instead went to the Make-A-Wish Foundation? So now when you're working out and you're on the treadmill, you're thinking of all the good that you're doing, for each pound that you lose, a child will get their wish, or whatever charity that they want to work for. And we argue that this is going to be more motivating at these lower incentive levels, when the incentive is small, than the standard self-benefiting incentive. But what if instead of $5, it was $100? So now this is a huge incentive. While people are running and working out, they're extremely motivated. And we argue that they're actually going to lose the weight. This is going to be very motivating. And the standard sort of incentive scheme is going to dominate both of when the $5 goes to charity or when $100 goes to charity when they're working. So as the previous papers went over, this is motivated by this theory of warm glow giving that was started by Jim in a series of papers. And this idea of impure altruism is that you get utility not from the outcome that the other person gets from your contribution, but from the act of giving. So an act is in like some sort of indicator function. I give and I get utility, but it's scope insensitive to the amount that my contribution actually impacts somebody else. So what this implies is that individuals should be relatively insensitive to the scope. So as you increase the amount that's going to charity per unit of effort, people are going to be working at around the same level. They're going to be working relatively hard, or at a medium level when incentives are low. And when you increase those incentives, you increase the amount that's going to charity per unit of effort, people are going to work about just as hard. But we know that from economic theory and the literature that standard incentives, when they're first introduced and when they're really low, they could actually be detrimental to effort. They can crowd out intrinsic motivation. Uri has, Stefan Meyer and Pedro Rabiel have this nice review paper that when you introduce the small incentive, this could actually be detrimental for effort. But we know that when that incentive level is there, when that standard incentive is there, when you start increasing, people start to work harder. So they are very responsive to the scope. You pay people more, they perform better. So hence, the kind of the point of this paper is that prosocial incentives could benefit, could be better than standard incentive schemes when you just pay people directly, but to a point. Particularly, prosocial incentives should not be sensitive to the actual outcome, to the scope of the incentive, but standard incentives are. So at the low incentive level, people could be working harder for charity than they are for themselves. But as you start raising the stakes and changing the scope, they're not going to work harder for the charity. They're going to work at around the same level, but they're going to be working a lot harder for themselves. So at some point, there's going to be a flip. So when you get to a high enough incentive, then people are going to be working harder for themselves than for the charity. And what I also wanted to test with a real incentive task and real effort and things like that, I wanted to see if people actually had an intuition for this. Whether if I asked them, would you rather work for charity or for yourself at the low incentive levels, which one would they choose? What about when I increase that incentive level? Which one would they choose? At the low levels, would they choose the charity, and would they switch over when I gave them high incentives? So that's the second study. So the first study is a real effort task. We recruited UCSD students to the lab. They all got a $5 show-up fee, and they squeezed this thing called a hand dynamometer. So it's this like electronic grip that's usually a medical device, but it's actually a really nice way to measure effort. They squeeze it, and you actually get their force output in newtons. The graph looks like that. Time is on the x-axis, force is on the y-axis. We could actually put a quantitative measure on how hard they're working. And the work that they were putting in is effort over 60 seconds. This is not an easy task. If you're actually trying to squeeze hard, it hurts your hand. When the incentive levels were high and they were going to the people, you actually saw people getting red and veins popping, and these real strong guys were sitting there busting out of their shirts. So it's actually kind of fun to run in the lab. The girls are, not, they're usually similar across. Their veins weren't popping. Anyway, so the effort is the total force over the 60-second interval, and we measured effort in 2 stages. So the first stage is the calibration stage. Everybody came in. Nobody was told anything about the incentive levels, and they were asked to squeeze this thing for 60 seconds to, quote unquote, calibrate the sensor. Nobody was told about the treatment. They all squeezed for 60 seconds. We recorded their output. Then in a between subject design, this is actually 5 cells, but part of it is a 2x2. They were either matched into a low incentive level or a high incentive level. At the low incentive level, 5 cents was earned for every 25,000 newtons that they exerted. And they knew about what that meant in terms of effort from the baseline stage. They knew what a newton is and how that corresponded to their effort. The high is $2 per 25,000 newtons. So what that amounted to is about, on average, at the low, they were earning about 50 cents, something like that. At $2, they were earning $10 for 60 seconds of work. So the high was pretty high, the low was fairly low. Then it was crossed with whether that money was going to them. So basically, the money was going directly into their bank account. At the end, they were paid out. They left the lab. And in another condition, money was going to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. In all conditions, money was always going to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. That's the only charity that we used. And importantly, people in the for self condition, when they were working for themselves, they didn't know about the existence about the for others condition. Everything was between subjects. So they were placed into an incentive scheme, and we saw how hard they worked. The control, they were basically asked to squeeze the device again, and just to get some sort of a baseline measure. We wanted to see originally if there was any crowding out at the low incentive when it went to them. If we didn't see any crowding out. But what we predicted is that in the low treatments, that people would work harder for charity when their effort went to the Make-A-Wish Foundation than when the money went to them. But as you increased, you went from low incentives to high incentives, all of a sudden they started working harder for themselves, or at least they about the same level as for the charity. So they shouldn't respond to the increase in the incentives when they were working for charity, but they should respond a lot when the money was going to them, when you went from low incentives to high incentives. So those are our 3 predictions, and this is basically the paper in this graph. So as you can see in the low incentives, people are working much harder for charity than they are for themselves. They're basically, this is on the y-axis is the ratio. It's the normalized measure of effort from their calibrated performance to their second round performance once the incentive was introduced. So as you can see, in the low incentive condition, they're squeezing about the same amount in the first as in the second. The amount, the low incentive really didn't motivate them by much. But when the money was going to charity, they squeezed significantly harder. But as you started increasing the incentive, they really didn't respond when the money was going to charity. They worked about the same level. It looks like less, but it's definitely not significant. But they responded a lot when the money was going to them. So at the low incentives, the prosocial incentive scheme was more effective than the standard one. And as you start increasing, it looks like there's a switch point, but the high incentive data was actually a little bit noisy. So statistically, the 2 points at the high incentive level are actually the same. So here, first we have to take a look at their first round performance to make sure there's no interaction with the treatment. There was no difference in the baseline measures in the calibration stage depending on the treatment. They were all the same. So now we can take ratios. And what we found is, as you saw on the graph, they worked significantly harder for the charity than they did for themselves. And they worked about the same, but directionally more for others than they worked for the charity. And the reason for that is, in the standard incentive scheme, they really started working harder as you increased the incentive. They went from about a ratio of 1.14 to a ratio of 1.74 when you went from low incentives to high incentives. But they didn't respond at all to the increase in the prosocial incentive. And we didn't observe any crowding out. In control, they worked actually directionally less than in the low incentive level. The mean was about 1, essentially. So we didn't see any crowding out, but basically no incentives looked just like the low incentives when the money went to them. So the next study is we wanted to see whether there was some sort of forecasting error, whether people had an intuition for this. When you put them in the low incentives, would they prefer to work for others or for themselves? When you put them in the high incentive level, do they prefer to work for others or for themselves? So we brought people into the lab, $5 show-up fee, same setup as before, except now they were put into either the low incentive level or the high incentive level, and we asked them, do you want to work for charity or do you want to work for themselves? If they actually got more utility working for others when the incentives are low, then they should choose to work for others for the Make-A-Wish Foundation at the low incentives and switch and work for themselves at the high incentives. But if there's some sort of misperception, then they should choose to work for themselves at both incentive levels. But it seemed like at least our subjects had the intuition that matched their effort choices. They chose, 77% of them chose to work for charity at the low incentive levels, and 85% chose to work for themselves at the high incentives. So this graph basically looks like, in terms of proportions, like their effort choices when they were matched into the condition and made their... Yeah, these are definitely statistically... So you're saying that we should... Right. Right. So I think that if we had more power in the other condition, my guess is that they would work harder for themselves at the high incentives. I don't know. You're right. So they were at least sophisticated in the low condition. So as I said, 77% chose to work for others than for themselves in the low, and only 15% chose to work for the charity at the high incentives, and 85% 8% chose to work for themselves. And the general pattern of effort was similar to experiment 1, but again, we can't really do this analysis because there was a huge self-selection issue. For example, there were only 4 people in the prosocial high effort condition because only 4 people chose to work in that condition. So to conclude, what I hope I provided some initial support for is that at the low stakes, at low incentive levels, prosocial incentives seem to be superior to standard incentives, and the effort is actually insensitive to the scope, which is consistent with the warm glow model, and that choice was consistent with behavior. So what are the implications for this? The implications is that when you don't have a lot of money to pay for something, if you have, for example, only $5 to motivate somebody to do a task that's relatively effortful, and you're worried about issues of crowding out of intrinsic motivation, a prosocial incentive scheme might be superior to compensating people directly. It would also be superior to not providing any incentive at all. As we saw, the control condition was much, much lower than the low prosocial condition. So what we're doing now is actually looking at situations where, for example, individuals are working for relatively low stakes and trying to run experiments in the field to see if we can introduce prosocial incentive schemes and see an increase in effort. So for example, something that we're running now is a recycling campaign where 5 cents goes to charity for every can you donate, rather than 5 cents goes to you for every can that you donate. Initial results are pretty startling. We got 2 or 3 times the amount of recycling collected when the 5 cents actually went to charity than for themselves, at least in the context of a student population. So obviously, if somebody who's, there's a significant portion of the population that actually relies on these sorts of things for income, and I don't think a prosocial incentive scheme would work very well there. So I think that is it. So thank you. Any questions?
So a low incentive scheme, how can you distinguish between true preference for working for others and simple aversion for being greedy? Because I assume that you were in the lab with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
well, either me or an RA.
Okay. So I would feel stupid to put a lot of effort for money, but if that is so, why do we see a lot of people using Enter, for example, that provide very low incentives to use it? So how can you disentangle?
So the choice condition was really something that could potentially disentangle it. So if you didn't really want to work for charity and were just working for charity to appear to not be greedy, then you should, in the choice condition, choose the standard incentive scheme and not work very hard. So if you actually didn't want to work for charity when you're being put into that incentive scheme, when there would be some sort of guilt motive or something like that. But since we found that people actually put themselves in the prosocial condition and conditional on being in that condition worked relatively hard, it seems like there is some sort of basic preference there. I think the we don't have that sort of data. I would say that if you, for example, increase the public nature of this, then the prosocial incentive scheme would be even more effective. I would say that it would probably be even more effective at the sort of high incentive levels that we're using. But again, I don't have that kind of data. My intuition says that public and private should interact with this effect. Does anybody have? Dan? Mm-hmm. Huh, that's really interesting. That's cool. Thank you. Yeah, but that's actually really interesting because here we have complete stranger, right? So it's not like you were working for somebody in the lab even. You were working for a charity. So that's really cool.
So when you did
calibration of the sensor, were they instructed to squeeze as hard as they could? Is that how?
No, they were just instructed to squeeze. Please squeeze to calibrate the sensor.
And so the sort of 1.1 average for the low incentive donation means that they squeeze just a little bit harder than.
A little bit, yeah. So the data, the reason that we normalized is directionally you get the same results, but the data is really noisy if you don't. Because you have, we have mixed genders here. Yeah, exactly. So we have, so we do have, so there's obviously a difference in just performance of women and men in just the standard sort of squeezing once, but the ratio is actually not, we don't have any gender differences in the ratio. Any gender differences in the ratio. So once you normalize, you divide the second round by the first round, there's no more gender differences in the effort. Right, so that's what we tested in the beginning, was to see if the treatment interacted with the baseline levels. So that was the first line of my results, was to make sure, because you can't, you're completely right, you can't use this ratio if there was any sort of interaction with baseline and treatment. Anything else?
We have another minute, or do we have any other questions for any of the speakers?
Yeah, just so basically to you guys about the so the question of volunteering and sort of donating time for most people who are salaried or we don't actually have a lot of flexibility in the short run to sort of determine extra hours for extra pay. Maybe over the long run, if my marginal hour I spend at work at some point in 6 years, another paper will get published and maybe I'll get raised or something. How do you think about that in the context of these sorts of experimental designs where, you're directly able to sort of allocate effort between volunteering and compensation?
Well, directly in the field, that's the route of criticism of volunteering. If I set this line, my sense is identified by the lab,
if I get $1 million to somebody, I shout about it, I'm going to feel better about myself. I understand it can be fixed better, but I think it can be the seed is innovation and engineering.
I mean, to be honest, I don't see that so much in the literature. At least I don't see that as really. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are a few pages. It's a hypothesis.
Yeah.
I don't think the evidence is that strong. We've seen the lab. One could, you could imagine an information content story where that would be true. I don't actually see how much you get. All I know is you get the signal value you get in, that would get that incentive. In fact, you should see if that's the truth. That's all it's motivating for what you get. Exactly. The bare minimum to get the signal.
Right.
Let me put that question a slightly different way, actually. So whenever we have this issue of giving time, we got to raise this question of, do I get the warm glow from the input or the output? In fact, that's going to be true in any model where you don't have a straight linear monetary technology, right? So your paper takes a pretty strong stand on that. It's all from warm glow. Jonathan's paper actually kind of allows both. I would say your results are actually kind of consistent with Bob's paper, as suggested here. If the warm glow is from the input, not the output,
Right.
then we get the flat line.
Right, and I do think that there's some evidence. I mean, so then there's an Ariely and Heyman paper in Psych Science 2004, which has a same flat line for social incentives. Yuval Rodenstreich and others have scope and sensitivity papers, a series of them, I believe. So I think there's some substantial evidence for this sort of scope and sensitivity. I don't think it's
There's one paper I think is really good, and somebody in the crew may have done it in the deadline, so I can't remember now. They looked at charitable giving where the plaque that you got was, I think, for a museum donation, and you get a plaque based on the amount of money that the plaque got bigger for different thresholds. And they looked at the data, and they found what essentially all donations around this level. I mean, essentially, if you get $1,000, you get a small plaque. 5,000, you get a slightly bigger plaque. And that's just where all the donations was.
Mm-hmm.
That suggests that, that size of that plaque is providing a lot of support.
Okay, great. Let's thank our speakers for a great.
Okay.